Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Berlin means, and this applies to most Anglo-Saxon countries. But what we are trying to show here is that things are quite different, especially once you're outside US and UK. And I said that the owners can be very concentrated. So there are dominant shareholders. So there tends to be more dominant shareholders. So you can say that these are concentrated. The share ownership is more concentrated, right? And then how do these owners maintain the control or the power? So of course you could use special voting rights or superior voting rights, but there are other ways to control the firm. Okay, so that is through complicated ownership. So one is the cross ownership pattern, and the other one is a pyramid structure. Okay, so this is where what we were looking at earlier this week. Okay, so I have just rearranged the slides from last week, but it's just order has changed a bit. Okay, so this is a paper by Krasson, Jankoff, and Lang. So this is a paper that I use in this week, and they find that these are the Asian, East Asian. Well, these are Asian. They say East Asian, but let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, well, wasn't sure if Thailand was East Asia, but anyway, they include Thailand, and they call this East Asia 9 countries. And then they look at whether in these countries firms have pyramid structure, cross holdings, controlling owners. Means that are there any large controlling owners, and also does management control. Right, so basically, is there management ownership? So what they see is, well, the pyramid structure or cross-holding seems to be quite prevalent, especially the pyramid structure. And you can see that controlling owners, right, alone means that percentage of companies, if there does not exist a second owner who holds at least 10% of the stock, which means that controlling owner is the largest and then holds large ownership, right? So, and you can see that is quite prevalent. Okay, so this shows that there is concentration, right? And also there seems to be this pyramid or cross ownership structure in these Asian firms. So that's what we saw. And this is the other paper that we look at, Laporta, Lopez de Selanes, and Schleifer. So they look at the ownership around the world. So they look at wealthy countries, 27 wealthy countries, and they only look at the top 20 firms, okay, ranked by market capitalization. And this is what they find. So this is a table that I use many times in this course. So you can see that I have the widely held means the company, in this case UK, 90% of the ownership is basically from dispersed shareholders. In the US, it's 80%. So if you look at this, you can see that US, UK is a bit more, is on the exceptional side, right? If you look at other countries, even Canada is like 50% widely held, right? Australia 55. So, so that's what I'm saying repeatedly, that the textbook view of this dispersed ownership applies especially, well, only to these Anglo-Saxon countries, or firms in Anglo-Saxon countries. So, and the family and the state, right, are the ones who actually owns more in other countries. In this table, actually, they split the the top and the bottom. The top one is high anti-director average, so which means that, and the lower one is low anti-director average. So this means that there's more protection, right, on the minority shareholders, for the minority shareholders. So that's the top group. So what they're trying to say is that if you compare the difference, right, between the low and high anti-director groups, the ownership, right, you can say the concentration is higher in the bottom panel, and then it's more widespread in the top panel. But as you can see, if you see the widely held, right, the bottom panel, the average is 0.16, the top panel is 0.3417. But you can see that mostly this widely held ownership is driven by US and UK. Right? Okay, so that's what we saw, right? And then this is the same thing done for Asian countries, and you can also see that that family and state owns quite a bit of ownership. So these are for the Asian. So that's what we saw, and I will skip this because we have seen this before. And then, I have corrected the title on this ultimate control rights. So before, I had this ownership, family owns, right? This ownership are wrong. Here, I have corrected. So in this example, right, the family owns A, 11%, A owns B, 100%. In this case, how about the family's ownership, or you can say the cash flow rights on B? It is 11%, right? Because it's 0.11 times 1, because the A owns 100% of B. So in this case, the ownership and the control is the same, right? Okay, but here you see the difference, and remember that how do you interpret this? Well, for the ownership, it's 2.3% because it's 0.11 times 0.21, right? But in terms of the control, it's 11% because family controls 11% of A, right? And A owns B of 21%, but this does not mean that family controls B, right, 21%, because the family only owns 11% of A, right? So therefore, in this case, basically, it's the 11%. If the family owns or controls 11% of A, then that's the amount that family can control B, which is 11%. So which is the ultimate control rights is the weakest link in the chain of controlling rights. So then this is the, a bit more complicated ownership. And here the family owns firm A and firm B, right? So family owns A 11%, and then the A owns B 21%, which is same as the previous page. And we know that firm family owns 11%, so 11 times 21, that's the ownership of B. But in this case, the family owns B through firm C. So in that case, it's 25%, ownership is 25% times 7%, which is 1.75%, right? But you are controlling firm B from two different channels. So therefore, you add this together, and that will give you 4.1% of ownership. So family owns 4.1% of family B through firm A and firm C. But what is the control? So remember that the control that goes through firm A is 11%, right? So that's the weakest link in this chain. But this family controls firm B through firm C. And in this case, although firm owns 25% of firm C, C only owns 7% of B, right? So therefore, the weakest link is 7%. So that's why the family controls firm B by 7% through firm C. So the total will be 11% through firm A plus 7% through firm C. Okay, so that's why you add them together. That it will be 18%. Right? So that's how you can calculate the ultimate control rights. So that's how, when we look at this table, right? See this cash flow rights and voting rights, going back to this table, right? So this voting right is basically computed using that method. Okay? So it's the ultimate controlling rights. Okay? So they do this for each firm. So in this case, like in Hong Kong, like 330 listed firms, these authors look at each one of them and see how the controlling, right, largest controlling shareholders, which has at least 5% of the voting rights, right? So they look at those largest controlling shareholders and compute how much they control, how much control they have for each firm, right? And then take the average of 330 firms in Hong Kong. And as a result, the largest controlling shareholder basically controls 28% of the firm on average, okay? And then that's compared with the ownership, right, of the shares, which is 24% on average for these 330 firms. And then what they do is, so that's the average, and then they compare this cash flow rights and voting rights, which is the ratio of cash flow to voting rights. But in this case, this ratio of 0.882 is not dividing 24.30 by 28.08, which are the means. Instead, what they do is they compute the cash flow rights and voting rights for each 330 firms, right? And then take the average. So this is the average of the ratio for 330 firms. So that's how you see this. So that's for Hong Kong, okay? So they do this for other countries. So that's how we, saw this. So before I didn't really, until this week, I just mentioned about the voting rights, right? But what these authors do is to do this kind of, they go through each ownership and then compute the ultimate control rights. So this work or this research, it has been very time consuming. So I know one of the researchers who used to work with them. So I've seen him go through all these information of companies, late into the evening, in his office. So this has been a very laborious, work to come up with this, table like this. Okay. So now, that's what we did, right? And these I showed you this example of Li Ka-shing's group, Lotte group, and then we look at LLSD, this paper by LLSD, and then what we saw was the difference in concentration for these 4 different legal origins. Right? And then the conclusion was that the highest concentration is with the French civil law countries, and then the lowest was with the German civil law. But also common law countries also had the lower concentration. But for the German civil law countries, this was mostly driven by Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Okay? And their explanation is that these 3 countries have been influenced by the U.S. law, which is under the common law system. Okay. So these are the tables. Okay. We did this. And then we did this external financing, right? So this is where we were. And so if the investors are well protected, creditors are well protected, then they are more, willing to provide financing, right? And from the firm's point of view, it is much easier to raise capital, okay? If the investors are well protected or creditors are well protected. So that's what we saw in this research. So here, first we look at the aggregate numbers, right? Aggregate. These are macro numbers, like external capital raised by the corporate sector, and then they compare with the GDP, right? And they look at other measures, like domestic firms per population, debt per GDP, and so on. And the last 4 columns in this table is the summary of this scores for rule of law, anti-director rights, one share, one vote, and creditor rights. Right. So these are the scores that is given for each country for these items. Right. So you can see just by looking at this, let's say anti-director rights, right? So the English origin country has an average of 3.39, which is much higher than this French origin, right? So this is confirming what we saw in the paper by LLSD. And one share, one vote is not that, actually, if you take the average, French origin country is a bit higher. But in general, English origin average is, is better. Okay, then what we were looking at is this regression. So this regression is trying to explain what determines the external capital over GDP, which is the number in the first column. Okay, so they're running a regression for all these countries. Okay, so each data point is a country. And explanatory variable, GDP growth, size of the GNP, which is log GNP, rule of law, either French origin, German origin, Scandinavian, anti-director rights, one share, one vote, which are the variables that you see here in this table. Okay. So after controlling for GNP growth, size of the GNP, you can see that effect of the rule of law, right? So rule of law, you can see that it does have, well, when you see this superscript C, B, or BC, this means that you can see at the bottom of the table, this means that it is significant at 5%, 10%. It's B, it's 5%. It's C, if it's C, it's 10%. And if it's an asterisk, it's 1%, right? So if it's asterisk, it's most significant. And the numbers in the parentheses are p-values, right? It's not a t-value, right? These are p-values. So what you do is you can get the t-value if you divide this coefficient, right? For example, 0.0617 for GDP growth, and if you divide with a p-value, then that's basically, oh, okay, this is, oh no, that's not a standard deviation, sorry. If it's a standard deviation, you can, actually divide it, and that will give you the t-value. But this is the p-value, sorry, yeah. So this is like if you're looking at, the significance level of, let's say, this is 0.02, right? So it means that 2%, 2.32% is like a significance. So which is basically lower than 5%, but greater than 1%, right? It's between 1 and 5. So that's why it is B. It's significant at the 5% level, right? So if you look at something like C, right? This is is this C? Yeah, it's C, right? Yeah. Let me see. Is this oh, sorry. No, these are not the p-values. Sorry. This is a standard errors. Yeah, these are standard errors. Yeah, I'm sorry. So standard error means that if you compare the size of the coefficient and you look at the standard error, if the standard error is much smaller than the size of the coefficient, that means the error is small, right? But relatively speaking, if you see something like well, yeah, this one, right? Say log GNP. If you look at the size of the coefficient in the first column, it's minus 0.0129, right? So that is the size of the coefficient. But then the error, standard error, is 0.333, right? So that means the error is much bigger than the size of the coefficient, right? So that means intuitively, it's closer to 0. So the error, it's like saying that, oh, okay, your estimate is, for example, on anti-director rights, right? The size of the coefficient is 0.1171, right? Right? But if you look at the size of the error, it's much smaller than the size of the estimate. Right? So that's why this is, you can say that in this case, a t-value is high, and then therefore it's significant at 1% level, okay? So it's easy to see, yeah, these are standard errors, so that's why you can see that if you compare the size of the coefficient versus the size of the error, magnitude of the error, you can see that if the coefficient is sufficiently larger than the error, then the significance level is there, right? You can see the ones that are not significant, like this one, right? The last column is 0.0091 versus 0.0324, right? So that's why the error is much bigger, right? So in that case, it's not significant. Do you see that? Yeah. So this is, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah, this is not a p-value. This is a standard error. Yeah. So in this kind of a table, yeah, sometimes they directly show you the t-value, right? And sometimes they use papers use the p-value, and then some papers like this use the standard error. Right? Okay, any questions on this? Yeah. Okay, so the takeaway from this table that we did earlier this week is that, yes, right, the GDP, the external capital over GNP, this variable can be explained by the rule of law and also the origin of law, okay? And also this anti-director rights and also one share, one vote, this also explains. Yeah. But if you put them all together, like in this case, you can see that German origin, for the German origin, the column, the second last column, right? You can see that the coefficient on German origin, which is minus 0.1849, becomes insignificant, right? But on the other hand, you can see that anti-director rights, this is significant. So this implies that the anti-director rights and German origin is correlated, yeah, probably weakly correlated. Okay, but if you don't put the anti-director rights, just use the three dummies, right, of French, German, and Scandinavian origin, then they are all significant. And remember that the sign is negative, right? And how to read this result is that for French, German, Scandinavian origin, these are dummy variables, either 1 or 0, right? If it's German, it's 1, otherwise 0, right? If it's a French origin group, it's 1. If it doesn't, if not, it's 0, right? So you have, it's like, you have 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 for French origin, and then 0, 0 for other firms, right? But if it's German, then it's 1 when it's German, and it's 0. So, so these are the dummy variables, right? But then this meaning of this negative sign is that it has a negative effect compared to or relatively to the English origin. Okay? So that is reflected in the intercept. Okay? So, but how to read this is all relatively to the English origin. Okay? It's like a intercept, or the whole line shifts down. Okay? So that's what it means. So like 0.3225 minus for French origin means that compared to the common, the English origin countries, on average, the GDP over external capital over GDP is 0.3225 lower on average. After controlling for the impact of GDP growth, size of the GNP, yeah, and the rule of law. Okay, so that's, and also for other variables in this regression. Yeah, so that's what it means. So is it okay now? How to read this table? Have you seen these kind of tables, regression results? You must have, right? You must have done statistics, or you must have seen something like this from other papers, other courses. Okay. All right, and yeah, so that's what we did. And this table was for the entire country level. It's for the entire country. It's a country level analysis. But here, we look at firm level. Right? Instead of looking at the aggregate country level, we're now looking at the firm level. The firm level, but it is averaged for each country. Okay? So here, the first column, okay, for Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, and so on, right? And you have US, UK at the bottom. So here, the first variable is market cap over sales. So this is market capitalization divided by the sales for each firm in Australia. Okay, so that's the average in Australia. So that, and the next one is Canada, right? Second column is market capitalization divided by the cash flow. Instead of the sales, it's divided by the cash flow. Okay. And the third column is debt over sales. So this is the amount of outstanding debt of each, individual firm. And you divide the debt with sales, and then take the average for the country. So that's our. And then the next one is debt over cash flow. So this is just the difference that in the denominator. And then this is the sample. It's explaining the sample. So this sample is taken from a database called World Scope. So it's a database. ANU has that. Our school has that. And then they're comparing against the coverage of all the firms in that country, or all the listed firms in that country. So the coverage is about 20%. Yeah, so which means that these are relatively large listed companies. Okay, it's not the entire sample of listed companies. But anyway, so that's what they look at. Okay, and this is for average. These are all the English origin countries, and then the next page, the next slide has the French origin, German origin, and Scandinavian origin, right? So the same thing, you compare this, right? English origin and the next page, and you can see that these numbers, if you look at the average, are generally higher for English origin countries than French origin countries. But of course, not all, if you compare with German and Scandinavian origin countries, some numbers are much higher for this German or Scandinavian origin, right? So, but typically, if you look at the market cap, right, it's the English origin countries typically have higher ratios. So let's see, yeah. But if you look at the debt, then let's see, English origin is 0.26, French origin is 0.27, so it's not much different. Actually, German origin is higher, right? So yeah, it depends on what you look at, but typically, if you look at the market value, the English origin countries have higher ratios. So this is when we look at individual companies. Okay. So therefore, if you look at external financing, firms operating in good legal environments can raise more external capital. In other words, investors are happier, right, to invest when you are more protected. So that's the basic message. So the next question is this, right? So if the firms can finance, it's easier for the firms to finance investment, then the firm should grow faster. Okay? So that's basically the next thing that we look at. So do they actually grow faster? Okay? If it's easier to finance, then you use that to invest, right? You use your financing to invest, right? For investment, and then you may grow faster. So this this paper by these three authors, two authors, sorry, the name is very long, This paper is called Law, Finance, and Firm Growth. It was published in 1998 in Journal of Finance. So this paper basically looks at the ratio of firms where the mean sales, so they look at the sales growth, and then they look at the firms where the sales growth grow faster than their predicted growth. So this is the measure that they use. So basically they compare the actual sales growth, okay, with the so-called predicted growth. Okay. So this is predicted growth is like the benchmark. So the benchmark is this. So the predicted growth rate means it's the maximum growth that they can achieve in the short term. Okay? It's a short-term financed growth rate. So, and they call this SFG, short-term financed growth rate. So this is the growth rate where the firm, right, reinvest all its earnings. Okay? So whatever they earn, right, they reinvest into the company, and and then basically maintain the growth. So it means that they're not doing any of the long-term financing. Okay? They're just putting the earnings back into the company, right? So that's how you measure this short-term growth. So that they put all these earnings and obtain enough short-term credit to maintain the ratio of its short-term borrowing to assets. So basically, they put the earnings back into the company and they maintain the short-term asset and borrowing at the same level. So that's what they define as short-term financed growth. So basically, the firm, if they grow at this rate, it means that they're not borrowing from outside. Outside means that they're not borrowing long term. So this is what they compute from, like the financial statement, okay? But then what they do is they look at the actual sales growth, right? The actual sales growth, and compare this with this so-called short-term finance growth, financing growth, short-term financed growth. Yeah. So if they compare these two numbers, right, sales growth and SFG, and if this is positive, it must be coming from long-term financing. So that's how they look at it. Okay, so there are two variables that they use. So this is the firm investment, which is divided by long-term debt. They call it PER LTV. I think it's percentage of long-term debt, yeah. And this is the firm investment over equity. So this is, I think it's a percentage financed by equity. That's what it means. Yeah, the first one is percentage financed by long-term debt. Right? So this is, you look at the firm investment and see, how much they borrowed. Okay, and how much equity they raised. So this would be a measure of, a long-term investment, a long-term financing. Okay, so if this is, close to 1, right, it means that the firm investment is financed by long-term debt or equity. Okay? But of course, the firms use both debt and equity, so it's probably won't become close to 1. But at least you can use this ratio to see how much firm investment has been financed by long-term equity or debt. And then try to use these two variables to explain the difference between the actual sales growth and the SFG. Okay? For SFG, it's the firm growth, right, which can be maintained without long-term borrowing. Okay? It's basically putting the earnings back into the company to just keep the company running and maintain the short-term asset to debt ratio constant. Okay. So let's see what they find. So this one is a bit small. Maybe I can make it larger somehow. Yeah, this might be better. Yeah. Okay. So if you look at this, so the dependent variable is the sales growth, actual sales growth, minus this short-term finance growth, right? So if the firm is actually growing much faster than so-called this SFG, it must be coming from outside long-term financing. And as you can see from here, right? So they have 4 regressions, and I have circled this low and order. So this is the score, right? Better low and order is higher. So therefore, you can see that the coefficient in the first column, right? Regression 1. The coefficient on low and order is 0.070, and this is 3-star, right? Which means that again the numbers in the parentheses are standard errors, and you can see that it's significant, and I think it's 3 stars, so that's why it's 1% significance level. Oops, sorry. Yeah, it's 1%. So, so this shows that if a country has a better law and order, then there's higher growth. Okay, so that's what this is showing. So you can see all from column 1, 2, 3, it's all significant, right? The coefficient on law and order is all significant, right? And the other variables above law and order are it's a market cap over GDP. Okay, what is TOR? Right? Inflation and bank. I think it's the size of the bank over GDP. Yeah. So these are the explanation is up here. Yeah. So so these are so you can say it's a country level, the control variables. So because they are, the situation, economic situation in the country is different, right? So you have to control for all these variables. And in addition to that, you include law and order. Okay? And let's see. So then it also controls for, where did it go? It also controls for the growth, right? So there are other control variables, but here the important point is this, okay? Look at this, right? This is the ratio of investment over long-term debt. So this shows how much, right, investment is financed by long-term debt. PEREQ is how much investment is financed by equity. Okay. So once you put this variable in the regression, which is in the fourth column, right, you can see these two variables are very significant, which means that these long-term financing, right, of the investment will generate higher growth, okay? Generate higher growth. So that's what it means. But once you include these two variables, PER LTD and PER EQ, you can see the rule of law and order. This coefficient becomes insignificant, right? So basically, these two, law and order, and this PER LTD and PER EQ are correlated. Right? So once you put these two variables, the last two variables in, then the law and order disappears, right? Disappear means the significance disappears. Yeah, so that's how you read this empirical table. Yeah. So, which means that, if you can finance your investment more, right, with a long-term debt or equity, that is a sign that you have better law and order. So if you have better law and order, it's easier to finance your investment with external long-term financing. Okay. Otherwise, you probably have to finance within your own, retained earnings, right? You have to use your retained earnings. In that, if you cannot go outside and borrow money, you have to grow with your own retained earnings. But that typically has a limit, right? So if you can borrow from outside, then you can grow your firm faster. But if you to borrow or raise money, then if you have better law and order, then it's easier, right, to raise capital. So that's where the financing and law and finance comes into play. So basically, these results are consistent with this paper by LLSD. Okay? Better law, legal system of better institutions. Under better institutions, investors are well protected, right? Creditors are well protected. Therefore, from the firm side, it's easier to finance. And if it's easier to finance, then you can grow faster. Okay? So that's basically the story. Yeah. So, so this is the summary. Yeah, so this is the summary. So there are various control variables in that regression, but after controlling all these, this table shows that law and order, right, is one of the significant variables that can explain firm growth. But once you include this PER-LTD and PER-EQ, which is a measure that shows how much firm's investment is financed by external long-term financing. Then this basically explains, these two variables explain firm growth, and that basically reflects law and order. In other words, these two variables are correlated with law and order. Yeah, so that's what we see. So in the end, yes, good institutions, right? In other words, good legal system, law and order, does affect firm growth, okay? Because firms can easily finance under a good system. So that's basically the bottom line. Okay. Yeah, so so that is, yeah. So any questions? No questions? Okay, yeah. In that case, next week we'll start state capitalism. Okay? So that will go on for 2 weeks. And then after that we'll go to family capitalism, right? And then we go on to corporate groups. Yeah. So we go more into details. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. See you next week.
Real quick,